Dandot Bandan Anakabar Sarvakala Samarathe Dolan Te Rakho Prabhu Nanak De Karahathe Firat Prabh Aya Paraya To Sarnai Nanak Ki Prabh Binati Apni Bhagati Lai नानक की प्रभ बेनती अपनी भगति लाई वाहिगुरु जी का खालसा वाहिगुरु जी की फतेह. So Satsang ji, with Guru's Kirpa, this week we're all remembering the Sikh genocide that took place at Sri Harmandir Sahib from the week starting the 1st of June in 1984. And over the next 6 days, with Guru's Kirpa, what we'll be doing is sharing 10 to 15 minutes of vichar, explaining the basic outlook, the basic information on what happened over the course of those 10 or so days. And today we'll be starting off with a brief introduction as to why the attack took place and the events that led to the attack happening. Now, just starting on this, when thinking about 1984 and the attack and the thousands that were killed, it's important to think about and understand the context in which this attack took place. And to understand that to a deeper extent, we need to trace our times back to 1947, which is when the independence of India was declared. And in that, at the time, Sikhs played probably the most important role in freeing India from the hands of the British and gaining its independence. And in particular, in terms of the Shahidiyan, the lives sacrificed for that independence, we find in many sources that Sikhs were around 71% of the total sacrifices given for India's independence at a time when Sikhs were only 2 to 3% of a population, so massively underrepresented in that narrative. Now, at that time in 1947, to a certain extent, Sikhs were given their own option as to whether or not they wanted their own land, their own country. But for whatever reason, we decided to stay with India. Now, many attribute that reason due to the false promises that were given by the people leading the Indian state at the time. Two of the main people was firstly Nehru, who was the Prime Minister of India and also the father of Indira Gandhi. And he's quoted saying at a Congress meeting that he sees no reason why Sikhs of the North should be able to experience the glow of freedom in Punjab. In essence, saying that you guys have helped us and been at the forefront for this struggle. Stay with India, you will be safe and you'll be allowed to live a luxurious and a fruitful life in the area of Punjab. In addition to that, Mohandas Gandhi, who's normally praised for leading the freedom of India, and rightfully so, he's also recorded on source saying that Sikhs have no need to worry about India turning their back on them. For if it ever does, the Sikhs are well prepared in order to defend their rights and if need be pick up arms when that time comes. So we hear that Mohandas Gandhi is actually advocating Sikhs to pick up arms if need be when it comes to protecting their rights. Now, these narratives are spoke about in 1947 but then very quickly forgotten about as time passes, and the same people that were advocating these narratives then go against them in 1984. So we see a shift of mind and a change of mind in the people leading that India at that time. And in addition, one more thing that we should all note in 1947 that was vital to the beginning of the tyranny against minorities in India, and something that still exists today, is an error in its constitution. So under Article 25 of the Indian Constitution, under subsections B and C, we find that Sikhs, Jains and Buddhists are all denoted as sections of Hinduism. So right from the offset, the very foundations that that country was made upon, people such as Sikhs are being denied the right of their own freedom and their own identity. Now, fast forwarding a few years, these promises have been made to Sikhs in Punjab, and shortly after the creation of India, we are treated very differently to all the other states in India. How are we treated differently? So first of all, Punjabi is not given the first language in Punjab, which is contrary to every other state in India. For example, in Gujarat, we had Gujarati as its first language, and so on and so on. So our language is being attacked. Secondly, our economy is being attacked. Punjab was famously known for the land of the five rivers and is still currently today one of the biggest resources in terms of water, electricity and farmer produce for the rest of India and its local areas. And also, all of that power was being dissolved and taken away from Punjab, even though it was Punjabis that was creating this for India, and an unright proportion given back to Punjab in terms of money, in terms of investment. So all of this culminated into what we hear of the Punjabi Suba movement, which is where Sikhs and other Punjabis were rightfully acting and protesting against these injustices. And it's important to mention that we weren't asking for anything above and beyond what everyone else was getting. The Sikhs were arguing and the Sikhs were rallying against the government so that they could get a fair piece of the pie, so that they could be treated equally as promised. Now this ended up with the Punjab Reorganisation Act in 1966. And here we see the original east side of Punjab, which was split in 1947, again further dissolved into the Punjab we know today. So now, initially in 1947, Punjab was split in half. And then in 1966, we lose Haryana and also some parts to Uttar Pradesh, which means that Punjab is now a sixth of its original size before the British had entered. Now at that time, Chandigarh is also given as Union Territory and also the capital of Punjab, which is slightly odd because Chandigarh is not in Punjab, which means it's given this label of Union Territory. What this means is that the power of Punjab has gone to the central government, and this, even till today, is the only government that's led centrally apart from Delhi. Every other state has full autonomy. They can decide where their produce goes, they can decide what their investment is spent on, they can decide on all these other political and social economic issues. So we see this discrimination against Punjabis and in particular Sikhs getting worse and worse as time goes on. And the Sikhs and the Punjabis do not stand for this, and they recognise that this is a direct attack on Punjab and the livelihood of the Sikhs that were living there at the time. So as a result, after the protests from the Punjabi Suba movement and not really getting anything of what was asked in 1966, we've come to 1973, in which the Anandpur Sahib resolution was first drafted. And the Anandpur Sahib resolution is a very important document in Sikh history, and that outlines what the Sikh of Punjab and also the Punjabis in general were demanding from the government. And the bulk of the argument in that resolution is that we want full autonomy. And autonomy means power or control over what is ours. So decentralization of the Punjab government, water rights, electricity rights, and also the rights to determine our own crop prices and all these other vital things for a decent livelihood of the average Punjabi person. This is finalised in October 1978 and is put forward to the government, and over the next 6 or 7 years we hear these continuous talks happening with no success emerging due to the lack of cooperation from the Indian government. Now, just before that, let's start to look at the main figures that were involved in 1984. In particular, the daughter of Nehru, who started this whole atrocity against the Sikhs, who is known as Indira Gandhi. Now, in 1975, she's committed electoral fraud and she's found guilty by the Allahabad High Court. Now, before she's kicked out of government, she does something very clever and very deceitful. She declares a national emergency, which postpones Parliament and also any upcoming elections, and allows her to rule by decree. In doing this, this spots massive outrage across India, and we see that Sikhs, in particular led by Sant Kartar Singh Ji, who was the leader of Damdami Taksal at the time, an institution where Sikhs would go to learn about Sikhi, they are spearheading the movement against they are spearheading the protests against Indira Gandhi, and we find that up to 40 to 50,000 Sikhs courted arrest in protest of her decree and ruling of decree and declaring of emergency. And also at the time, Sant Kartar Singh Ji themselves lead 37 protests, which is a constant thorn in Indira Gandhi's foot. And she recognises this, and it always stays with her as history delves out. So we've got the Sikhs that are speaking up for their own rights, speaking up for the rights of Punjabis, and also speaking up for rights of Indians as a nation against Indira Gandhi and also the government. Now, there are many plans that are hatched in order to take a blow at the psyche of the Sikh, to try and suppress our voice, because at the moment we are the biggest threat to the tyranny that the Indian government is causing. And one of these planned threats was in 1978. So this was when the Anand Prasad resolution, just a few months before the Anand Prasad resolution, had been formalised on April the 13th. And we hear that on the day of Vaisakhi in Amritsar, one of our holiest cities, we have the fake cult of the Nirankaris led by the fake follower Gurbachana, and he starts a procession which is state sponsored, which is led and protected by the Punjab police, in which he makes a mockery of the Panj Pyare by making his own version, which are called Sat Satare. He also attempts to make a mockery of the Amrit Sanchar ceremony by making his own version, and also disrespects Guru Granth Sahib Ji Maharaj whilst going around and doing that procession. When hearing of this, the Singhs at the time, in particular from the Akhand Kirtani Jatha and also the Singhs from the Damdami Taksal, hear of this and go to protest peacefully. As they approach that procession in Amritsar, there are 13 of them are made shaheed and countless are made with injuries. And this was all with the backing of the Punjab police, so clearly state-sponsored. Now, this was a blow at the sentiments of Sikh psyche and of our religious beliefs, and this was one of the main things that geared up a lot of the Naujawan, a lot of the youth, to realise that we are being attacked currently and we need to start organising ourselves so that we can protect not only our lives, but also Sikhi in terms of its history and also in terms of its philosophy as well. So, in 1977, just before that, Indira Gandhi loses an election and then is reinstated in 1980. And this, over the next 3 or 4 years, is where the propaganda campaign against the Sikhs starts to manoeuvre and grow rapidly. We hear that in general media, through TV stations such as Doordarshan TV, that Sikhs are disloyal, they're violent, and they're most important, one of the main things that puts us in a bad light is this notion of Sikhs being this separatist community, that Sikhs are now trying to leave India, and this worries many Indians and many people in the public. Now, many people attribute this propaganda campaign towards the attempt of Indira Gandhi trying to get Hindu votes in a majority Sikh population in Punjab, and trying to cause conflict between Sikhs and Hindus at the time by putting out this narrative that Sikhs are disloyal, Sikhs are violent, and Sikhs are trying to claim their own homeland, which there is no evidence to suggest the former. What's important to note is that Sant Jarnail Singh Ji, who was the leader after Sant Kartar Singh Ji, who has now taken over this protest and also this movement to free the people of Punjab, he stated that when he hears of these propaganda campaigns, that why on earth would Sikhs try to leave India when we were the ones that gave so much initially for its freedom? Now, on this notion, it's also important to mention that Sant Jarnail Singh Ji is also recorded saying that we are not here demanding Khalistan or this separate state for Punjab. We are here trying to claim the resolutions of the Anand Prasad document. But if it is offered to us, we won't make the same mistake as in 1947. So over that time, we also see a direct physical attack on the Sikh youth in Punjab, and hundreds of people are made shaheed in fake encounters, which is something that is very prominent after the times of 1984 and the Kargur Lahr that was initiated as a result. So after countless useless negotiations and our demands falling on deaf ears, we come to 1982, where, led by Sant Jarnail Singh Ji, the Sikhs started the Dharam Yudh Morcha. Dharam means righteousness, and Yudh means battle. Morcha could be taken as an agitation. So this is where we see Sikhs take a more formal approach of a protest, such as courting arrest, such as doing road blockades, and it's been mentioned that over 100,000 Sikhs in Punjab courted arrest in order to try and catch the eyes and also make the Anand Prasad resolution come to the forefront of the dealings. So whilst this Dharamyudh Morcha is continuing to grow, we find in the background the Indian army working very hard to plan this attack on the Sikhs. And this starts from up to 18 months prior to the attack in 1984 in June. From 1982, we find that the Indian army have made a real-life replica of Sri Harmandir Sahib in a place called Doon Valley, which is in Chakrata Hills, which is not far from Uttarakhand. So from 1982, plans have started and mock battles, mock raids of Harmandir Sahib are being practiced. In 1983, Margaret Thatcher sends 600 commando forces from the SAS to help train the Indian commandos in preparation for this attack. Now, after realizing what was about to come and the Indian army was preparing to attack the Sikhs, because of the voice the Sikhs had and because of the popularity that Sikhi was gaining in Punjab, Sant Jarnail Singh Ji prepares the defence along with other great generals such as General Subheg Singh in 1983 by entering Sri Harmandir Sahib complex and preparing fortifications. Now, in 1983, there's one more important thing to mention, is that Indira Gandhi actually declares president's rule in Punjab. What this allows her to do, very cleverly, is that it disbands the Punjab government and it allows her to replace the Punjab government with her own personal staff, which in essence aids the preparations for not only the attack at Harmandir Sahib, but all across Punjab. So, now we get to the year of 1984 and just before that 1st of June when the attack starts. And up until this point there have been many talks, all of which have fell on deaf ears. From 1947, Sikhs have been protesting peacefully, but nothing has come to of any avail. And on the 3rd of June, as part of the Dharamyudh Morcha, what the Sikhs agree in terms of this agitation is to stop all shipments of grains leaving Punjab, which would have been very detrimental for India, as 60% of the grain for India came from Punjab. In addition, as part of this Dharamyudh Morcha, electricity and also water supply going out of Punjab was to be detained. So it's quite interesting, and that date, the 3rd of June, is worth noting because that was the day the Indian army actually entered Harmandir Sahib, something we'll talk about in a day or two. So just before the attack on the 1st of June and before the firing starts, we hear from many sources that access and also exits to Punjab are closed. So Punjab is starting to enter this state of curfew. So in terms of the story so far, we're just going to leave it there for today, Sadhu Sangat, and tomorrow we'll actually start the story of the 1st of June and how this battle commences. At the end of every talk, what I'd like to do is just to go through 2 or 3 misconceptions every day of questions that constantly arise from Punjabis, from Sikhs, and also from other Indians and people looking at this story, just so that we can clarify some of these points and that there's no doubt left at the end of it. And I'll finish off by referring to some of the sources I've used to get this information, and also some places you can find further information to do your own research as well. So one of the first things that the Indian media plastered everywhere was that Sant Jarnail Singh was a terrorist. And I just want to mention 2 accounts from non-Sikhs that counter this argument. And the first one is by a famous historian called Joyce Pettigrew, who has a book called The Sikhs of Punjab, which I'll show you in a second. And she describes Sant Jarnail Singh as following. She says that he had wished religious values to be placed at the centre of life. In democratic societies of the West, these values wouldn't be termed religious, but rather as civil libertarian, i.e. referring to a state that has political freedom, and socialist. Secondly, we have Vandana Shiva, who is the author of Violence of Green Revolution, which was written in 1999. And they describe Sant Jarnail Singh and their following as their following grew, he successfully regenerated the good life of purity, referring to a good life of a Khalsa. And also that Sant Jarnail Singh's talks and their prachar at the time broke people away from pornography, from drugs, and attached the people of Punjab to Seva and Gurbani. So clearly going against that false narrative that Sant Jarnail Singh was a terrorist. And these are just 2 snippets of non-Sikhs commenting on Sant Jarnail Singh's Subha and the revolutionary they were. There are countless more that you can find yourselves. And one more general misconception I want to address before we finish off is that this attack was a last resort. In the Indian white paper for the attack, they say that Sikhs were about to declare their own country and it was a state of national emergency. this couldn't be further from the truth. And in addition to the Chakrata Hills that I mentioned earlier, the preparations that were started from 1982, we have one of the most famous Indian generals from the time, General Sinha, who was actually initially control of Operation Blue Star, but he was taken off the case after he tried to put things in place which would allow the least amount of deaths in Harmandir Sahib. And in defense of him, he actually set out a plan that would mean a very respectful approach to Operation Blue Star, which was rejected, and he was pushed away because of his approach, and he actually denied, and he actually said, I'm not going to take out many civilians that are in Harmandir Sahib, and he rejected the operation, and he's been claimed and rightfully so respected by Sikhs for his decision at that point. So he said, and he also mentions in his autobiography, that preparation started more than 18 months before, clearly showing that this wasn't a last minute resort, that these preparations started well before. So I hope that started to address some of the misconceptions, and we'll look at a few more over the next 5 days. So just a few takeaways and finishing this off. It's important to understand that as per the Hukam of Guru Gobind Singh Ji Maharaj, that only pick up arms when all of the means have failed. This is exactly what the Sikhs did from 1947 up until 1984. Even in 1982 in the Dharam Yudh Morcha, everything in terms of a protest was done peacefully. And it's important to realise that Sikhs weren't asking for anything special. We were just asking for the same treatment every other state was receiving at that point. And it's also important to take some inspiration from this, that as Sikh, we have never remained silent in terms of injustice, whether that's upon ourselves or anyone else. And it's important that we learn about the politics of Punjab, because this is the land of our Gurus, and this is the land of our people. And the battle definitely continues today, but the battle today is without bullets and without gunfire. And that battle is behind closed doors. And the battle now is on our history, on our language, on our women, on our children in terms of female infanticide, on our water. Punjab has one of the highest counts of uranium poisoning in the world, which is why cancer is thrive throughout Punjab. On the treatment of our farmers, Punjab has one of the highest rates of farmer suicide in the world because of the debt cycles due to fertilizers that the government are endorsing upon Punjab farmers. And also the massive attack on the Sikh psyche by introducing alcohol and drug shops left, right and centre in Punjab, so that people don't have a chance to think about Sikhi, let alone standing up for their rights. And it's important to understand that the first step to overcoming any problem, because many of us get quite down about this whole Punjab issue, is first of all to recognise the problem, but second of all to understand it. And that's one thing I'll implore all of you to do leaving this video. And finishing on that is, we see from the leaders of the Dharam Yudh Morcha, and what we'll see over the next few days, is that this political movement, this socio-economic movement that was started, the backbone of it were great Guru Sikhs that were high in their Sikhi. And without this Sikhi, without this Bhakti, without the Seva they had done for many, many years, this Morcha, this protest, this movement would have not had any success. So when in our own lives, whether it's something as big a scale as this, or something smaller at work or school or in your personal lives, remembering that Sikhi is the backbone for a Sikh, and all of our power comes from Sikhi, comes from Gurbani, and comes from Seva. And as Guru Nanak Dev Ji Maharaj has said, Jinko Sadguru Thapya, then Mir na sake koi. That Sikhi has had many attacks upon it, whether it's been the British, the Mughals, the Pathans, or even now today the Indian government. We are still standing, and that is because Guru Nanak Dev Ji Maharaj themselves has laid the foundation for this path. So I'm just going to finish off with a few books I used to source the information, and some great reads on this part of our history. So the first one was one I mentioned about Joyce Pettigrew, which is called The Sikhs of Punjab, which I'd highly recommend. Another great one which talks about the build-up for 1984 is written by Akal Publishers, which is called Reflections on 1984, and that really highlights in a well-descriptive way how things built up. And again, the last one I'd mentioned on today's talk is Lost in History, which is called 1984 Reconstructed, which is a very short book written by Ganesha Kaur. So these can be purchased on Amazon. I implore you all to do your own research on this and delve into the history, because this 15-20 minutes would definitely not have done it justice. If you have any more questions or you are interested in more information on this, there's a talk on our channel called 1947 to 1984 Synopsis, which you can find more information on these things. So while speaking, I would have made many mistakes. I would have got a few figures wrong. Please do forgive me. And most importantly, we ask the Sangat for their sisa so that we can continue this seva, and also so that you keep us in Chardi Kala and close to Guru Sahib's Charan at all times. So we'll see you tomorrow for the second part of this series at 1 p.m. If you have any questions, please feel free to message us via our social media or drop us an email. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.